Certainly happy to speak to this particular congregation of God's family. The gentleman who gave the opening prayer talked about this beautiful home, and he was referring to the auditorium. I think that's a very apt phrase to use. It is a beautiful home for the family of God. Your warmth is certainly very encouraging and very cheering, and it is a blessing to be able to spend the Sabbath morning with you. How many of you have ever seen a baby born? Can I see some hands? Ever seen a baby born? Thank you. That's a lot of you. How many of you have ever seen your own child born? Can I see hands? Not the same hands. A few less. Thank you very much. The birth of a child is a very exciting and wonderful occasion. I remember when my wife was ready to give birth to our first daughter, we had to drive about 140 miles south of Cincinnati, Ohio, where we were living at the time, down into the mountains of central Kentucky, which is an interesting place to have a baby. It was impossible 25 years ago to find a doctor who would even remotely consider natural childbirth in a conservative town like Cincinnati, Ohio. It simply wasn't done. We called hundreds and hundreds of doctors, and they all said we were sort of strange, and it was viewed as an aberration in those days. But we were determined that my wife would be awake and that I would be present. So we looked, and after months of searching and looking everywhere, we found a retired country doctor. He'd been retired, in fact, a long, long time, longer than I thought initially. Way back in the mountains of Kentucky near a little city named Hazard, which some of you have perhaps heard of, television fame. And he said he was willing to come up to central Kentucky and deliver the baby naturally if we had it in somebody's home. He said, no hospitals will allow that type of procedure, but he said, you find somebody's home near my home and I'll let you be present. He meant me, of course, and he said the baby could be born naturally. So we made a deal with the gentleman. We found members in Jessamine County, Kentucky, about 130 miles south of Cincinnati, Ohio, people of great kindness and love and generosity. And they offered us their home for the event. They had a small house at the foot of the mountain, and when my wife was 9½ months pregnant, we simply moved in with them and waited for the birth to occur. And ultimately, as always happens, it did. My daughter arrived on February the 14th in the midst of a true mountain blizzard. They don't have a lot of snow in central Kentucky, but they had a lot of snow that day. Squalls of snow. Kids always pick the worst day of the year to be born, and my daughter certainly did. The retired country doctor in his 70s was frightened to drive on all the snow. I called him up and said, the baby's coming, and he said, well, it may be coming, but I'm not. It's too snowy, and I'm not coming. And I talked him into it, and several hours later, after I called, he made it through the tempest in a perfectly foul state of mind, to say the least. He was very upset. He didn't want to come. The hours dragged on, as they always do, for a first birth. And, of course, the snow piled up outside. And my wife's labor proved to be quite long, a lot longer than anticipated. And, of course, he became increasingly upset and agitated and peevish. And finally, after several hours in an outburst of impatience, he informed me the time was up. And I thought, what does that mean? Time is up, he said. And he told me he was simply going to accelerate the birth by removing the baby manually. Now, I will not describe what that process implies. Farmers might understand. And frankly, it is both illegal and unethical and horrifyingly painful. So at that point, without the use of surgical gloves and no instruments of any type, he began to do what he had threatened. Now, I was horrified. My wife, of course, was in terrible agony. A lady who was a church member and had been a nurse was present. She told me what the doctor was in the process of doing. So I informed the doctor that if he did not cease and desist immediately, I would, one, throw him out of the house. I was a young man and a young future father. You say things like that when you're young. I told him I would ask him to leave immediately, and I would report him to the AMA, the American Medical Association, which of course disciplines unethical doctors. He responded, he looked at me and said, young man, I'm retired. And he said, I don't care what the AMA thinks of me. I've made my money. He then attempted once more to remove the baby manually. Well, I took his arm and I pushed him rather forcefully into a corner of the bedroom, and I asked him to sit down and leave my wife alone. And he did. He just sat there and continued to mutter terrible things. He sulked, and he said the baby will take another 24 hours, and the snow is stacking up, and I'll never get home, and what will my wife be thinking? And he said he was sick of all the hassle and wished that he had never come, and of course I was thinking the exact same thing. Anyway, my wife's labor at that point increased quite dramatically, in fact, and suddenly as I stood there, still fuming about this altercation with the doctor, and the doctor was still muttering over in the corner, suddenly I found myself watching my firstborn daughter come into the world and take her first breath. And I'll never forget, as long as I live, the first time she looked at me with those gigantic eyes. I'd never seen a newborn baby before. I had no idea what it would be like. She was over 10 pounds, which is a big baby for a first baby. She was pink. It wasn't blue as many newborns are. She was pink, and she had gigantic eyes. And, baby's head swells during birth, so her eyes look even bigger than they actually were. And I remember being almost shocked because suddenly she was there looking quite normal and pleased with life. We immediately began to count fingers and toes. It's funny what new parents do. You think you would notice other things, but you do count fingers, and 5 here and 5 there, and are the nails on all the fingers and all the toes intact, and that kind of thing. And the doctor was still in the corner muttering various dire predictions about the future and our relationship, that is his and mine, and that type of thing. But I could ignore him at that point. We had a baby, and life was fine. It was a memorable, unforgettable day, to say the least. It was a little scary, though. You understand what I'm saying? When a baby's being born, you do need a professional there to facilitate and to direct the proceedings. And we had a horse doctor, not a professional. We picked a loser. Now, in 1987, of course, the Church of God would never recommend that, young parents decide to have a baby under that kind of almost primitive circumstance. We didn't recommend it then, but that was something that we did in our lack of wisdom. In this day and age, whether a baby is born in a birthing clinic, and there's some wonderful ones around, or in a hospital, or perhaps at home, if that is your personal choice. And of course, the church does not, recommend one or the other. These are choices that you make. Nonetheless, you should have somebody skilled present, very skilled. That is God's way. And we didn't. We simply didn't know enough to work that out the way we should have. Well, our daughter was born, and I gave the gentleman his hat and a check for $50. He asked for $100, and I told him, "You're not worth it." I gave him $50. And he took it, though. And I told him to leave, and when my daughter was about 3 minutes old, he was walking out the door. And that was that. I then determined that the next time we would plan things a lot better, and we would find a real doctor for any future birth that would occur. At that specific point, my wife hoped there never would be another birth, and we were not looking forward to having another child at that specific juncture of our lives. But memories dim, and you start again. And we did, and we wanted a professional the next time. 2 years later, after our transferal from Ohio to Montreal, Quebec, Canada, my wife was again great with child. I mean, that time she was really great with child. She had gained a lot more weight and was much, much larger than for the birth of her first daughter. We thought that was rather unusual. Why was she getting so large? But, we didn't know. So we found a real specialist. He was well known. He had several titles. And we weren't going to blow it this time. We wanted a professional there. And he said he would be willing to deliver the baby naturally. But he also said, "I'll have to come to your home." He said, "No hospital in Montreal at this point in history will allow a natural birth. It simply is not popular or done here." He said, "Can I come to your house?" And I said he could. And he said, "You can be there." And I said, "Good." So on July the 23rd, 1965, the hottest day of the year, it was 100 degrees in Montreal. Humidity was just, hanging off the trees. It was oppressively hot. And kids always pick the worst day of the year to be born. They always do. And my wife went into labor, and we called the doctor, and he said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. He said, "Not to worry, I'm on my way." And I didn't worry. He was on his way. Only problem was the pain suddenly jumped from 8 minutes apart to 3 minutes apart suddenly, in a few seconds. And at that point, I turned on the TV set. I was getting somewhat unnerved. And I found out on the TV that there was a massive traffic jam on the DeCarry Expressway, the worst in 10 years. Total gridlock going on to the east side of Montreal. And I knew our doctor had to get through that mess to get to our house to deliver my second child. Now, he got through an hour and a half later, but my second daughter was born 5 minutes later. I remember so clearly my wife and I were alone in the bedroom. Nobody else was there. And I was holding her hand, praying for God to heal the DeCarry Expressway soon. And my wife said, the baby's coming. She'd already had one, so she knew what it felt like. And 5 seconds later, I watched my second daughter take her first breath. She was over 9 pounds, I think 9 pounds, 4 ounces, very healthy and pink. And I remember to this day, I will never forget it, looking at her in total shock because I wasn't quite prepared for that. And she just lay there. She didn't cry. And all the books say newborn babies cry, and she didn't. She just lay there, and she had this incredibly pleased look on her face. They assert that a newborn cannot smile, but she smiled and looked very pleased with life, didn't cry, and she has had that look has stayed on her face to this day. She's never stopped looking pleased. And I'll never forget the look. Well, what do? My wife and I counted fingers and toes and looked to see if all the little nails were intact on the fingers and the hands, 5 here, 5 there, 5 here, 5 there. And I was feeling a little bit proud that I had in effect delivered my second daughter. Now, I had almost delivered my first daughter. The doctor was in the corner and he wasn't looking at us. But the second daughter I had delivered. I was feeling sort of good about that. And suddenly my wife tensed and said, I'm having another labor pain. That was a minute later. And I remember thinking, well, maybe it's like an aftershock. Earthquakes have aftershocks. You know. And why not, mothers who've just had a baby, maybe there's, after labor pains. What did I know? And then she had another very strong one. That was 30 seconds later. And then there was a third pain. This took all of 1 minute and a half. 3 labor pains. And then to our total amazement, there was another baby lying on the bed, a foot away from her twin sister, now barely 2 minutes old. And no, we didn't know we were going to have twins. You see, our specialist had only heard one heartbeat. And he had commented on the fact that my wife was rather large. And this was going to be a very, very big baby, that he had no idea how big he was going to be. We knew how to pick him. Well, I instinctively picked up my third-born daughter. She was visibly having some trouble breathing. There was mucus in her nose as well as in her throat. And with the help of my mother-in-law, who had not wanted to be there for the birth of any babies at all, she was in the kitchen making tea. She ran up to see the baby and arrived just in time to see another baby being born. My mother-in-law somehow, as I picked my third-born daughter up, and we both instinctively somehow recognized something was sort of wrong, my mother-in-law with her fingers took the mucus out of her mouth and drained it out of her nose. She just did it almost without even thinking. And then a little tremor ran through my third daughter's body. She was over 8 pounds, so she was not a little baby either. But I remember her body, there was a tremor. And my third-born daughter breathed the breath of life for the first time lying in my hands because I was holding her, you see. And when she breathed, I felt her body, I felt the tremble in her body when she breathed the breath of life for the first time. And once again, that is a memory I will never forget as long as I live. Never forget that, never. Well, I called the nurse. The doctor was, of course, in a traffic jam on the DeCarry Expressway. I called his nurse, and the nurse said, have you ever cut an umbilical cord before? This was on the telephone. I said, no. I said, I'm not quite sure what an umbilical cord is. And she described it and said, sterilize some scissors, and we did all of that, and I cut the cords, and I found some shoelaces and all the things you see on television when this happens, in the back seat with the policeman. I did all of that for both of my daughters. And my mother-in-law then bathed our newborn twin daughters and put them in a crib. We had only one crib for them. We didn't know we were going to have two. We had to buy another crib that day. So I spent my afternoon looking for a cheap crib. And then the specialist finally arrived an hour and a half later, and he patted me on the back, and he said to me, good work, young man. And he checked her heartbeats, drank a cup of tea that my mother-in-law made for him, asked me for $75 and left. So my firstborn daughter, we paid $50 for her and $75 for the twins. That's $125 for 3 kids. Not bad. Pretty good deal if you ask me. He said to me, I have to ask you for something. I came here, and anyway, $75 was it. Another one of those memorable, unforgettable days, to say the least, etched into my memory for eternity. I would like to say this, though. Don't try to duplicate what I did, please. That was done in my youth. Perhaps not one of the sins of my youth, but one of the unwise decisions in some ways of my youth. Maybe it couldn't be helped. Maybe it simply happened. Maybe we did our best. And, of course, God was merciful, but don't try to set things up so that those things occur in your life. That would be somewhat unwise. God is merciful when we don't know any better. Well, there were a lot of other unforgettable days as they grew up. I could talk about so many things. I remember the first blessing of children's service, and that's also impressed in my mind. The first time after the birth of each of my daughters, at or after the Feast of Tabernacles, when the ministry calls the young families and young couples forward with their newborns, or new people with their little children, and lays hands upon them as Jesus Christ did. And I did that as well. Maybe you've had the experience of sitting in the front row or standing and holding a newborn or a 3-month-old child, and a minister of God lays his hands upon the child, and as Jesus did, ask God the Father to bless the child. It is even more moving when the child that you're blessing is yours, you see. And I've imparted that blessing one by one to each of my children in turn within months of their birth, and that's a wonderful occasion. And then as they grew through childhood and into their teens, I remember so vividly when it became obvious in their late teens that God was granting each of them repentance. And there's something very exciting when you see the process of internalization of the way of God occurring in a child raised in the Church of God, and you realize they have begun to serve God and to walk with God, not only because it is the family way of doing things, but because they have a relationship with God that has begun to grow. And I saw that happening. I had the blessing of baptizing each of my daughters one by one in their 18th year of life. I didn't do the actual counseling. I don't think that would be appropriate. And how can you be fully, totally objective with your own children in terms of repentance and that type of thing? They counseled with other ministers. But they asked me to perform the baptisms one by one myself, which I was very pleased and happy to do. I remember leading each of my daughters into the water. And I didn't sit in the side of the pool, by the way, which you heard about in the sermonette. I walked into the water with them. I remember laying hands on each of them in turn after the baptisms were over, and I was the instrument, humanly speaking, through which God gave the Holy Spirit, the begettal of the Spirit of God, to each of my daughters. And those were exciting times, very memorable days. And I'm sure that many memories we have as parents and as servants of God, we will carry with us into the kingdom of God. Why should memories like that fade? I'm quite sure they won't. I think they'll be there, on into eternity. And I look forward to that, thinking back on some of those events in 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, and they'll still be there. In the last several years, of course, there have been other exciting events. There have been the weddings. 3, of course. 3 daughters, 3 weddings, it all computes. And I've had the great blessing of performing each of the weddings one by one. It is an exciting, deeply moving experience to escort a daughter that you've raised down the traditional aisle, as it is called, and then watch her take the arm of a young man whom God has brought into her life. And then, of course, most normal fathers, and I'm not a normal father because I'm also a minister, most normal fathers can then sit down in the front row beside the wife of their youth, and they can watch the proceedings and, try to keep the tears back in the tear duct because, men aren't supposed to cry. At least society says that. I don't believe that, but society says we should try. Wives never do, but fathers try to sort of keep their composure. But I could never do that. You can hide in the front row. I could never hide on those occasions. During the weddings, my wife had to sit down by herself. It always fell my lot to continue down the aisle and then to stand before them as father and as minister. Now, that's hard. Now, I understand that. It's hard enough to walk down the aisle with the daughter. That is emotionally creates quite a bit of pressure. But then I had to continue down the aisle because I'm also a minister and join their hands, and I was very glad to do that. Place my hands on their joined right hands and to ask God to bind them as husband and wife. Very moving occasions, and again, those are memories that I will never, ever, ever forget. as long as I live, and I'll carry those memories with me into eternity as well. I've done it 3 times in 4 years. And now, in one sense, the active parenting phase of the cycle of life is completed for my wife and I. We no longer have kids to raise. We do have children, you see, and we still parent on at least certain levels, but we no longer have kids to raise in our homes. And the nest is empty, as they say. But our lives have been enriched in so many ways that we could not have even begun to imagine that very memorable day, about 25 years ago, 1963 it was, month of March, when we realized quite directly that my wife was going to have a baby. You know, when you wonder, you're not sure, you think maybe you're pregnant, and then you have nausea and morning sickness for the first time, and then you know for sure. They didn't have these little kits in those days to find out. You had to wait for the morning sickness. And my wife that morning had a big bowl of strawberries for breakfast, a big bowl of strawberries. And we went visiting after breakfast, and she'd been fine, though she felt a little funny and thought she might be pregnant. And we were driving through a suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana, past the construction site, and there are all these young guys out there about 10 feet away from us building a house. And as we drove by, suddenly my wife looked rather strange, rolled down the window of the car very, very fast, and those poor guys on the construction site, I don't know what they thought, but it was an exciting day for us, but it was an exciting day for them too, I can assure you. Dramatic. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of it all. An incredible 25 years. Lots of joy, lots of lessons learned, quite a bit of repenting. I'll talk about some of that in the sermon today. Some tears, all of it worth it though. There's a prophecy in the book of Psalms, chapter 128, I'd like you to read, that I identify with. I think every family in the Church of God that has children should read Psalms 128 from time to time and see themselves in the wording of the psalm. Because this is, in effect, describing you. There's a prophetic implication here. And it certainly applies very graphically and very directly to all families within the worldwide Church of God in this end of the age. Psalms 128, verse 1, "Blessed is everyone that fears the Eternal and that walks in His ways. For thus shall," verse 2, "you shall eat the labor of your hands, and happy shall you be, and it shall be well with you." A wonderful description of life. "Your wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the side of your house. Your children like olive seedlings," not just little plants, but seedlings, growing up, little tiny olive trees that have to grow and be pruned and nurtured and worked with. "Behold, thus shall the man be blessed that fears the Eternal. The Eternal shall bless you out of Zion, and you shall see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life." And notice there's a prophecy in verse 6. "Yea, you shall see your children's children, your grandchildren." You'll see them someday. Wonderful prophecy. "And peace, full peace, total peace, now imminent, peace upon Israel." A very exciting promise. And it dates the prophecy and the teaching in the psalm. Now verse 6 focuses in as well on a new phase of the cycle of life that my wife and I are now entering. My first grandson was born almost 18 months ago now. His name is Jeffrey Lee. Jeffrey after his father, Jeff Molnar. Lee after his great-grandfather, Lee Cephak. 4 generations in our particular worldwide Church of God family. And as a consequence of that particular birth, the time has come for my wife and I to watch the children that we have raise their children. So it's a new part of the cycle beginning. And understandably, it's a nostalgic time for my wife and I. So many memories come flooding back into our minds as we watch our first grandchild grow, and we think of so many things that we should have done when our kids were very little that we didn't do, and that we wish we had done. I think in retrospect, it seems we did a lot more things wrong as our children were growing up than we did things right. I know a lot of people, a lot of parents think that way. We meant well, of course, but we were young, as most parents are. Isn't it sad that, youth is wasted on the young? Somehow that's the way it is. We were young. And you make mistakes when you're young. We were amateurs at child rearing. We'd never done it before. We were dilettantes in that particular area of life, and blissfully unaware of some of the most basic scriptural teaching about the raising of kids. Today, brethren, I'd like to talk about some of our personal experiences, some of the good and some of the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll talk about all three. And tie in some scripture with it, perhaps clarify your focus as well as mine in this very vital area of raising children. Initially, I'd like to discuss some of the things that my wife and I have talked about of late that we would do very differently if God gave us the opportunity to roll back the years and to start all over again as young parents with little tiny daughters. It would be so nice to step into a time machine and simply go back with what we know now and have learned over the years and start all over again. Any of you have kids would like to be able to do that? Can I see some hands? Would you like to start again if you could? Right back at the beginning. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not alone in this particular feeling. The mistakes I try very hard not to make, if I could just go back and begin the whole process afresh, and maybe some of you who are young families can learn some lessons from it, and those of you whose kids are growing, as ours are, can perhaps do some repenting along with my wife and myself. Number one, mistake that we would try not to make if we could do it again. We would try much, much harder to make it crystal clear to our children from day one how much we love them. We would talk to them more. We would express greater warmth and affection in an obvious way. We would build from the earliest beginnings a deeper emotional bond. Notice I said deeper. Now there was a bond. There was a bond from the beginning. And we loved them dearly. But they didn't always recognize that the bond was there when they were tiny children. There was a certain degree of emotional deprivation. And I'll explain how that occurred. The problem was this. As a young minister with a large, vast area to cover, I was often gone day and night, literally, sometimes day after day, and when they were babies and little kids. So I became, in their minds, a friendly stranger. I was there on Fridays, Friday evening dinner. I never missed that. I mean, years went by, I never missed Friday evening dinner. I was there that evening. And I tried to smile a lot, but they didn't always recognize what the smile implied because they didn't see me smile enough. I simply wasn't there. During those early years, even my wife was not with them as much as she needed to be for full and complete and total bonding to occur. I had a vast area in the first 5 to 10 years of their lives. I felt the presence of my wife on visiting, during visits, and that type of thing was essential. So very, very early, our 3 tiny daughters were passed around to a series of kind, caring, wonderful, very willing babysitters. They were all wonderful women, members of the Church of God, who viewed our daughters as if they were their own kids. And we were with them as well, but we weren't with them enough. So ultimately, brethren, we found our 3 tiny daughters becoming insecure. They seemed to be anxious and worried when they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age. They would have a worried look on their face. One of them in particular would flinch when I picked her up and sort of turn away from me when I tried to hold her. And she was small. She was exhibiting what some specialists call stranger anxiety. Stranger anxiety. But you see, I was her dad. And she had that reaction for several years. Well, I'm sure she recognized that I cared for her. I'm sure my kids all knew that we loved them. But you see, the heart-to-heart, strong emotional bonding that would have enabled them to grasp how deeply we loved them had not occurred in sufficient measure in those early years. They knew, and yet there were questions in their minds. So insecurities grew. They always grow under circumstances like that. Until they were 4, 5, and 6, and we could see the insecurity, we could see the anxiety, and slowly we began to understand and realize what was wrong. But even then it took several years, brethren, to strengthen and to mend the bond, and there are still some scars. And as I said, we don't have kids to raise anymore, but we have not stopped parenting because there are still some wounds that have to totally heal, and that takes some balm, and that takes some work. And we haven't stopped working on that. Why is a heart-to-heart bond between parents and children so incredibly important in the end of the age to God and to the Church of God and to parents and to children? I'll tell you why. If I had time, I could prove to you that a deep emotional bond, a very deep heart-to-heart bond between parents and children is a major factor in the creation of emotional stability in the lives of a human being, in the life of a human being. And when that bond is not there, there's going to be a vacuum or a kind of a gap, and things begin to fill in that gap that are often negative. It gives a child a sense of security to know that he's loved. And the stronger the conviction is the more secure he becomes as a human being. And that's so vitally important. When it is not there, they'll develop fear syndromes, they'll develop insecurity, they'll develop anxiety, feelings of anxiety, various complexes. Bonding also becomes a determinant for motivation as a teen. When a young person is not bonded with his parents during his teenage years, he may well lack motivation and become rather apathetic and lazy and have very few goals and very little ambition. Bonding lays a foundation for morality as an adult, and that needs to be understood. It's an axiom, you see, that children who are closely bonded to their parents when they're little are less apt to reject their parents' values and standards as an adult. Now, I realize it can happen, even when there has been very close bonding, even when kids are like this, when the heart-to-heart bond is strong, it nonetheless can happen. There are so many pressures in our society. There are the pulls of the world and peer pressure and all the rest of it. I know that. But if bonding is there, you have put the odds on your side. You have. They're less apt to reject your values when they become an adult. They still happen. But the odds are in your favor. It can also be demonstrated if bonding is non-existent or if bonding is weak. But a child is much more apt to rebel as a teenager, more apt to go through an angry, uncivil kind of a stage. He's more apt to resent parental authority, especially that of his father as a teenager, when bonding has been weak, when the child is very, very little. Malachi 4 is a wonderful prophecy. I have to quote it to you in this context. And if you read Malachi 4, you'll find that heart-to-heart bonding is the foundational principle of child rearing in the end of the age. That's what Malachi wrote under the inspiration of God. Chapter 4 is a prophecy of our work, of the commission given to Mr. Armstrong, and now on the shoulders of Mr. DeKoch. And we'll see in this context that we must have a focus on love within the family. Love within the church family, love within the individual families that make up the Church of God. Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, the end of the Old Testament. And an unusually powerful, dramatic focus is given here. Verse 5, Malachi 4. And if you're a parent, you've got to think about this and analyze what it means in terms of you and your kids. No matter how old you are or how old your kids are. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And notice the message, verse 6, describing our work and the commission given to Mr. Armstrong and now carried out by Mr. DeKoch. He shall turn the heart, notice, of the fathers to the children. That is, he will build a strong emotional bond between fathers. It also includes mothers, of course, and their children. I want you to notice, it talks about the heart. Now, the heart is the seat of the emotions, not of the intellect. Little tiny kids are so incredibly emotional. They're not all that smart when they're 2 or 3. Their little brains are developing. They can't speak 5 languages. Their vocabulary is limited. They're very, very emotional, though. We're talking here about the heart of a child and the building of a bond, first of all, from the father to the child, that will change the child's life in a dramatic way. He will turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and then notice the sequence. Then, as a result of that, the heart of the children will then turn to the fathers. Notice how it occurs. Second phase. Father first turns his heart to the child. That's phase 1. Phase 2. The child then responds to the parent automatically. Phase 2. A sequence here. And this must happen within the Church of God, and it is happening. And it must increase. The end of verse 6, lest I come, Jesus Christ is speaking, and I smite the earth, the world, with a curse. Now, I submit to you in the light of that particular prophecy, and it's a dire prophecy, that heart-to-heart bonding with your kids. And it doesn't matter how old your kids are. You see, it doesn't say parents and little kids. It just says fathers and sons. You may be 75 years of age, and your son may be 51. Still applies. You see, this is not limited to our young couples. It applies to adults in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s whose children are also adults. And if there's alienation, you can begin to rebuild a bond. God says this must occur lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. So He will destroy us with the world if this does not occur on a broad basis within the worldwide Church of God. I often find myself as a college part-time instructor. I teach only one class in the college, but it gives me a window into the college, and Some of the kids come and talk to me from time to time. And I counsel with various young people. Some of them, most of them, in fact, have been raised in the Worldwide Church of God. Some of them are your kids. They come and talk to us in the college. Our young adults, the fruit of our bodies and the fruit of our system and our standards and our values in the Church of God. Sometimes I deal with severe instability. I deal with young people on occasion with a proclivity to depression. Some of them have major emotional dysfunctions. This is not common, but it does occur. And when it comes up, I invariably discover that bonding has been weak with one or both parents, generally with the father. 90% of the time with the father, on occasion with the mother. And may I say, brethren, the stories I hear have a disconcerting commonality, and it's saddening. Sometimes it just, for a few hours afterwards, I really feel unsettled by it. Invariably, there seems to be a workaholic father involved. An honorable man, a good man, dedicated to his job, who's gone a lot. Gone a lot. He works long hours. And the child perceives, as he grows up, these long absences as indirect rejection by the father. Now, it really isn't in the father's mind, but it is in the kid's mind. So you see, weak father-child bonding occurs. They never really see each other very much, and they draw apart, and something begins to happen to the child's heart. It talks about the child's heart here in Malachi chapter 4. The heart doesn't turn to the father. The heart becomes cold. This little sensitive, warm, loving, emotional being begins to become a whole colder and cooler and moves away emotionally from his parent or his parents. Now, over the years, I don't know how many church kids have said to me something along the following lines. Mr. Catherwood, I love my mother a lot. I really love my mother. And you know, I respect my dad, but we're not close. My mom is my best friend. I can say anything to my mom. But Dad is gone so much, and I respect my dad. I think I love my dad. I'm not sure, though. I want to love my dad. And I've had church kids break down in tears and say, Mr. Catherwood, how can I know if I love my dad? How can I make my dad love me? Love my mom. And I respect my dad. We're not close. And I hear it time after time after time after time. And what does Malachi 4 mean to you, brethren? What does it mean? The last few years, along with the fathers, there's been a further weakening of the bond, and hearts are being damaged. Mothers are going to work now, even Church of God mothers, and consequently much of the nurturing of some of our church kids is being done by grandmothers who are wonderful people, but they can't fill in for mothers. It's being done by other members or by babysitters or by daycare people, and they're wonderful people too. But you see, I gave my kids away to babysitters way too much when they were little kids. Now, some babysitting is essential. Kids need that experience. But I did it an awful lot. And they were fine people. And it doesn't replace Dad and Mom. Some of our church kids are being raised by nobody or by TV sets. We have more and more kids with empty hearts. Did you know that? We have more and more kids who have not bonded to Dad or to Mom. And if you don't bond to Dad or to Mom when you're little, you'll go through this tumultuous period of time as a young adult, and you'll have a terrible time bonding to anybody. Wife, husband, your own kids, when you become an adult, unless God works a miracle in your life, which He can and will do. But it'll be hard. We have kids with hard hearts. And they should be soft, loving hearts turned to Dad and turned to Mom, and they're turned in some other direction. But you know, when your kids turn off, when they turn elsewhere, you know what the sequence is in Malachi 4? You turn to them, they turn to you. If they've turned away from you, it's because they feel you've turned away from them. That's how they perceive it. Kids are such emotional beings. It takes far more attention, love, hugging, holding, talking, to convince them that you love them than you perhaps think. But you got to do it to lay a foundation for emotional stability in the future. And a couple of hours of so-called quality time every evening just is not going to cut it. That I can assure you. Wish I could tell you some of the stories, but it would be, in a sense, betraying confidentiality. One I can tell you, because this I can couch it in, let's say, anonymous terms enough so that I don't betray any confidentiality. Remember a young woman raised in the church kid, drug addict by age 14, OD'd twice by age 16, ended up in a psychiatric hospital. I went to see her. She was lying in a bed with eyes that resembled burned out sockets. And I asked her why she was doing this to herself and to her family and to me. Because I liked the kid. She'd gone through a lot. She had a lot of insight for a 16-year-old. She said to me, Mr. Catherwood, I'm paying my parents back. She said, I've always felt invisible at home. They never had time for me. My mom had her own problems, and Dad was always gone. His job was his God. She said, if Dad had spare time, he'd pray and study. She said, you know, what little time he spent at home, he spent it in his office praying and studying. She said, as a little kid, I used to resent God so much because God took my father away from me. He made him pray and study, and he had no time left for us. Could you believe that statement? But I heard a church kid say that. And then the clincher came, and I can quote it verbatim because the words made such an impact on me. This is exactly what she said. Quote, all I've ever wanted was for my parents to love me. 16-year-old. All I've ever wanted was for my parents to love me, and they haven't. And now I'm going to pay them back. Now I'm going to pay them back. And she did. Yes, she did. Brethren, you always pay the piper. You pay the piper. Now, you know, her vision was simplistic. Her vision was egocentric. She saw what she saw. It wasn't totally accurate. Her parents did love her. I've talked to her parents. I've seen them cry. They wanted so badly to help her. But you see, it was too little, too late. Too little, too late for her. She perceived herself as being invisible. They didn't know that. They didn't mean to have that happen. They didn't want to have that happen. That's how she perceived the situation. It was an inaccurate perception, but it was a teenage perception. How do your kids perceive your relationship? Maybe not the way you perceive it. Maybe you think you're the greatest dad on the face of the earth. Is that what your kids think of you? On a scale of 1 to 10, what would your teenagers give you? Don't ask them because you may not want to hear. You may find out they wouldn't give you a 10. Maybe they would. If they would, well, that's great. But I'd say in some cases they might not. What about your 7-year-old? What would he give you? You know, there's a weak bond. There's a distance between you and your kids. No matter what the age is, whether they're 12 or 17 or 25 or 50. If there is coldness there, how do you reverse the situation? I'll tell you quickly and then we'll get into it. First of all, you turn your heart to them. That's how you do it. You make your concern obvious. You write them some letters. You tell them how much you love them. You start to listen a lot. You ask them why they're angry. You ask them why there's coldness. You apologize if it's your fault. And slowly, as you open your heart to them, they will soften. It'll take a while. The older they are, the colder the heart is, the further away from you it's been turned. But it'll turn back. It'll take a while. Like a branch in a big tree. It'll take a while for it to turn back, but it'll come back. Proverbs 23, verse 22 is talking to adult children, and the statement is made by an even older parent. Proverbs 23, verse 22. Wonderful principle of child rearing. It implies that we can rebuild a heart-to-heart bonding at any age. It simply gets harder when they're little tiny kids. They want so much to love and to be loved. They want so much to please and to be pleasing. When they get into their teens, if you haven't done what you should, it'll begin to turn. You see, they'll turn away, and it'll get worse as the years go by. But you can turn it around with some work and some love and some praying. You can do it. Proverbs 23, verse 22. Hearken unto your father that begat you, and despise not your mother when she's old. This is not talking to young couples. This is an elderly woman with adult children, you see, and older parents, people of my generation and on beyond. Verse 23, notice what it says to the children as they become adults. Buy the truth and sell it not. You know what that means? It means as you become an adult, accept your parents' values and standards. It means to us, come into the church. It means to us, accept the way of God. Because that will be so pleasing to your parents and to God. Hearken unto your father and your mother. Verse 23, and buy the truth. Don't give it away. Don't rebel against it because they've made some mistakes. Don't go out and sow your wild oats. Buy it. Ask for wisdom. Get instruction and understanding. That's what God wants of our young people. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he that begets the wise child will have joy of him. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing your kids as they grow up become successful. Odds on your side, you see. My son, give me your heart. Let your eyes observe my ways. When bonding has occurred, then internalization of the value system is much more apt to occur as well. I didn't know that when my kids were little. I had to learn some of those lessons. I've been playing catch-up for a long, long time. I think we caught that particular lesson just in time, just on the edge. And, when our kids were 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'm not sure they were convinced that we loved them. They sort of knew. I think they are convinced now, because we've tried to compensate and taken some work. But I think they know that. Now, how about your kids? Do they know? What about, your 40-year-old son and your 65? Does he know? Maybe he needs to know. Maybe you need to tell him. Second thing we would do differently, very quickly, I want to go on to the second mistake we made that my wife and I would try very hard not to repeat if we could do it all over again, knowing what we know now. If we could roll back the years, we would try very hard not to over-discipline. That is, to discipline to excess our children. We would certainly use spanking as a tool to correct our children. We would not view spanking, however, as a miraculous cure-all and as a panacea for any and every problem, which we did, unfortunately, 25 years ago, until we figured out that that was not the way of God and not what the Bible said. Now, may I say, brethren, the main reason for this misplaced focus was the influence of several members and some ministers who have now gone from the Church of God many, many years ago, and they gave us the impression that this was the biblical way to go. I remember the statement was made in a sermon by a minister who's now gone from the church. At one point he said this, and I quote, "The purpose of discipline is to break a child's will. Spank a child when he's disobedient until the will is broken." Now, that statement was certainly not based on biblical principle at all. God does not want us to break our children's will. He wants us to direct it and to channel it and to shape it and to mold it. That's the way of character. A child whose will has been broken, on the other hand, often becomes little more than a puppet. A wounded, damaged puppet at best. Almost incapable sometimes of incentive and decisive action and all the things we want our kids to show when they become young adults. I've seen young adults raised in the Church of God. And the result of that kind of fundamentally authoritarian, not authoritative, but authoritarian, manipulative, perfectionistic regime. And once again, there's a commonality in their reactions as adults. You see a lack of incentive. You see a lot of confusion about life. You see hesitation. They're very hesitant. There's a fear, an excessive fear of failure. They're afraid to step out. They're afraid to go out and really get a job. They're afraid to do something with themselves. They sort of hang back. There's a certain superficial conformity sometimes to the way of God, but it is mere conformity. It is not automatically internalization of the value system. There is depression over lack of accomplishment. They hold back. I began to see that in my kids when they were 5 or 6 years of age. There was a hesitancy. And we knew something was wrong. We began to do some analyses. And we had to begin to change some things and to compensate. And again, we caught it just on the edge. Too late to do away with all of the damage, but soon enough to somehow begin to give a lot of positive reinforcement, and we limited the damage that was being done. When I look back on it, I sometimes cannot believe that I could have been so stupid. Now please understand, we did not beat them. We never slapped our kids. We didn't lash out and pummel our kids. We didn't leave blue marks on their bodies. We were not child abusers. But they were spanked for things they should never have been spanked for far too often. And it left marks. I remember one Sunday, living in Paris, France, I decided to take our kids to see one of the old Walt Disney films called Bambi. Remember Bambi, the little rabbit named Thumper, and cute little film in some ways for kids, I guess. That was in the late 60s. It was playing at a big cinema on the Champs-Élysées, and I thought that they'd enjoy it. So I wasn't awful to my kids. I did do things with them and tried to be a good father. I just didn't know how. And I thought it'd be nice. So my wife, I dropped her off at the Prix Unique. That's a discount store, sort of like Woolworths or Woolco or what do they call these places? There's the big stores where they sell everything real cheap. My wife likes places like that. And she wanted to go to Prix Unique on the Champs-Élysées and shop, and I took them in to see Bambi. The twins were 3 and Susie was 5. And they loved the movie. They loved it. Up to the point when Bambi's mother was killed by the hunter. And I forgot about that. I'd seen Bambi when I was a little kid, but I forgot about the shooting and about Bambi's mother being killed. And at that point, the orphan fawn Bambi began to cry in the most pathetic voice you can think of. "Mother, where are you? Mother, where are you?" It was absolutely heartbreaking. And suddenly all three of my daughters, who were very tender-hearted, burst into tears and began to sob loudly in the theater. And there were three of them, remember. And they got louder and louder because they heard each other, and it got worse. Kids will sort of, work on each other. And people began to turn around and look and stare and glare, and other children in the theater began to cry. And, of course, I told them to stop, but my display of authority only made things worse. You see, they were all three in mourning for Bambi's mother. I should have known that. They were in mourning for Bambi's mother, and nothing I said was going to be able to temper their reaction. Now, in retrospect, I think it was their first actual encounter with the concept of dying. They'd never been to a funeral. Somehow they'd never really sensed what death meant. They'd heard the word. It was their first encounter with it. And it was a terrible shock for these three little tiny persons. And it was a time to comfort them, perhaps to walk to a nearby park and talk about death. It was a time to teach. It's a time to teach, brethren. Time to talk. I didn't know that. I blew it. I thought it was a time to spank. I thought my authority was being challenged. I had said, "Don't cry." And they had kept on crying. So what did I do? Well, I took them out to the bathroom and I spanked them. They were already crying, and I spanked them, and they cried even more. One by one, I spanked them. It was a cure-all, or so I thought. We then left the theater, all three of them sobbing quietly. I walked to the prise unique, found my wife, and told my wife that Dad had had a real rough day with the kids. If truth were to be told, it was the kids who had had a real rough day with Dad. That's the way it actually was. And what lesson did my kids learn from that spanking? Well, they learned it's bad to be sad. Good lesson, huh? Bad to be sad. They learned it's bad to mourn the death of a loved one. Is that a valid lesson? They learned that you get spanked no matter what you do. You get spanked when you're bad, and you get spanked when you're good, and you get spanked when you're sad. Absolutely crazy. That kind of discipline actually blurs the difference in a child's mind between good and evil. You see, what is good and what is bad? Ultimately, everything's sort of bad. They're bad. The world is bad. It doesn't work. Corporal punishment should be reserved for those things that are truly bad in a child's reactions and attitudes. And there are enough of those things, of course, and those things we should spank for. When we finally began to focus in on it, Proverbs 22, verse 15, had a major impression on my mind. It's a key to discipline. Turn to that if you would, please. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 15. Notice what it says. Key to discipline. We finally saw this and began to change. Just in time to limit the damage. Verse 15, chapter 22 in Proverbs. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction, that means corporal punishment, will drive it far from him. Now what does spanking drive out of a child's character? It says foolishness here in Proverbs. Not sadness or sorrow or awkwardness, foolishness. Analyze the word. It means folly in one translation. In fact, that's what it says in Italian. It says follia, which means craziness, madness. One English translation uses waywardness. Another says a proclivity to be delinquent. Another defines the word as the process of going astray. The brethren, crying because Bambi can't find his dead mother cannot be labeled by any stretch of the imagination as delinquent-type behavior or going astray. Simply can't be. When a 2-year-old accidentally spills his milk, that isn't folly. That isn't being crazy. It's being awkward. Universal problem most 2-year-olds have. The little muscles don't work too well yet. So they pick something up and down it goes. You don't spank for that. You teach for that. You talk about that. You have them pick it up and put it back down and pick it up and put it back down so the little muscles sort of work together and coordinate. You don't spank for that when they're 2. Now when a 5-year-old picks up his milk in a glass and dumps it over the side of his chair on the floor on purpose, that is folly. And you do spank for that. And he is not being awkward. That's a little bit different. There's a time to teach and a time to train and a time to instruct. There's a time not to spank, and there is also a time to spank. And we have to realize that in the Church of God. Well, at age 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, finally, after they began to go to school, we began to analyze our children, see what was happening. Something wasn't working. We limited the damage by changing and using spanking from that point on as a tool, not as a cure-all, but as a tool. Now, please understand, brethren, we did continue to spank. We repented with tears. But we did not ditch jump, go to the other extreme, label all spanking as bad, turn to jelly, and become permissive. Now, I saw that happen far too often back in the 70s. Parents who had overspanked their kids in the 50s and 60s suddenly underspanked their kids in the 70s. And the kids went from too much to too little. And the mental and emotional confusion of these extremes can devastate a teenager. It's devastating. Don't ditch jump. Somehow we almost did that. We were racing in that direction from too much to too little, and we caught it in time, and we didn't make that mistake. But we were on the way. Some of you are still doing that. There's a time to teach, a time to spank, and of course I don't mean child abuse. Children should never be spanked in anger, or punched, or pinched, or clobbered with a hairbrush. I've seen that happen in the church. Or beaten with a big stick. We used a very small ping-pong paddle. We still have it at home, in fact. It's in a place of honor. And I would do it again. I haven't changed it on that. And we would apply a little ping-pong paddle beginning at age 3 or 4 or 5, someplace in there, in necessary degree, so that it stung to that area of the anatomy called by some the seat of learning. And I have not turned to jelly on that particular issue at all. I would still do that. I simply wouldn't do it as often or as hard or for all of the same infractions. I'd like to list, though, briefly a few things we would still spank for and give you some food for thought. This is not an official Worldwide Church of God list, by the way. This is an official Carn Catherwood and Joyce Catherwood list. And I just want you to realize that. It's our list. It's an imperfect list. But these are the things that we finally realized we should spank for, and if we did it again, we would continue to spank for these things. Temper tantrums. A child flings himself on the floor, screams in anger. I think that's folly in the Proverbs 22 sense. I would still spank for that, and I really think you should too. Talking back to parents, impudence and cheekiness certainly qualifies as folly, though I would hasten to add that impudence and talking back is also a sign of rejection on the part of a child, especially on the part of a teenager, and that often occurs when the principle in Malachi chapter 4 has not been fulfilled by the parent. The heart is turning away. If they become very impudent, the heart is definitely turning away from you, and you're going to have to bring it back. And that and that not just through discipline, but through active love and affection and reinforcement. Lying, I would still spank for. Definitely folly. Pouting and sulking, I'm quite sure it qualifies as folly or delinquent behavior. It's manipulative and shouldn't be allowed to continue. Deliberate disobedience after a clear, precise, specific instruction has been given. And I do stress the phrase clear, precise, specific, understandable instruction. And then that is challenged, and that is not accepted, and that is flouted. I feel discipline should be given then. And even little kids can get the point. My new grandson got a few spankings when he was 7, 8, 9 months old for a few things. And as he got closer to the age of 1 year, he got a few more. And now at a year and a half, there are 8 or 9 things that his parents spank him for consistently, and he knows what they mean. I bump into people who say, oh, little kid doesn't know. At a year and a half, they can't make a connection between a specific act of rebellion and a spanking. My grandson, whose name is Jeffrey Lee Molnar, knows. Yeah, he knows. He's been taught not to push the button on the TV set. He's been told very specifically not to do that. Because you see, the TV set isn't very big in his home, and he could actually, because he's strong, push it over. It could fall on him. It could hurt him. He could break it. He's been told, don't push the button. You see, that button is such a temptation because it's fun to push it, and then the TV comes on, there's noise and all that kind of thing. Big temptation. About 2 months ago, he thought he was alone in the living room with the TV set. My daughter was spying on him, looking around the corner, however. They never notice you when you're doing that. Until they're about 3, then they notice. You can't do it anymore. He walked up to the TV set thinking he was alone, and he gazed rather thoughtfully at it for about a minute. He just looked at it. He was standing about a foot away, just gazed at it. Then he slowly moved his hand very close to the button, but didn't touch the button. Just close to it, and he looked around. Nobody was there, he thought. Didn't notice his mother looking around the corner. So he moved his hand a little closer to the button, almost flush with the button. And then, I thought this was incredible, then suddenly, under his breath, and my daughter heard him do this, he said, no. And he jumped back about a foot. That's called conscience. Conscience. No. And he looked around again to see if a big hand from nowhere would suddenly appear, you see, to spank him. And no hand suddenly appeared. Then bold as brass, he just walked up to the TV set, pushed the button, and turned it on. He was 14 months old at the time. See, that's my boy. He's got Catherwood genes. I never thought that part of me would come out in my grandchildren, but it has. You say to me, all these little kids, they can't understand things. Basic instruction, they don't know. You kidding? He's developing conscience. Actually, tried to get him to stop. That's why he said no to himself. But human nature won out. He got spanked for that. One more thing that you should spank for. I'm glad I wasn't there, because that would be so cute. I don't think I could have. I would have gone for a long walk while my daughter spanked him. I would have left the house. But it was good that she did. One more thing, discipline should be used, and that is sleeping in church. Most of the time. There are times when they're ill or not ill, but they're teething or something, and they're fussy when that's hard to affect. But you have to be firm about that, otherwise your wife may not hear a full sermon for years. Now, every child is different. There are different systems of getting kids to sleep in church. Some may sleep on a mat. Some will sleep over your shoulder. There are little kids that will only fall asleep if you go out in the hallway and you get away from the noise of service. You can put them to sleep during the sermonette. You can bring them back in. Others go to sleep in the mother's room. Others want to sleep in some kind of a car bed or whatever that you might have. I'm not recommending a specific method. I'm simply saying you need to work it out somehow so that your little kids sleep in church when they're small, so that your wife can hear the sermon most of the time. You can't always pull it off. It's complicated, but you need to try. And one other very important point, remember this. Hebrews 12, verse 6 makes it clear that discipline must be done in love, never in anger or in a fit of frustration or impatience. That means this. After every spanking, brethren, there needs to be a period of reconciliation when you hold a child, and as long as he wants to be held, not 10 seconds, as long as he needs to be held, you express affection. You see, during the spanking, very briefly, that bond is going to be broken in the child's mind. Something happens to that heart-to-heart bond. He's in pain. You have hurt him. He understands theoretically why you've done it, but you need to re-knit the bond. You hold him closely, and you comfort him, and you express affection until you know the bond has been re-knit, and everything is fine between you and him. The heart is turned back to you. That heart-to-heart bond is there. The crying has ceased. Then he knows why you spanked him. See, discipline with love will build respect in a child and a stronger self-image and control. I could read Hebrews 12, verse 9. I won't for lack of time. Discipline without love. Discipline when the child doubts your love, when he's not sure. It will create bitterness, anger, rebellion, and a battle for power as soon as the child moves into his teens. And none of us want that kind of reaction to occur. Now, those are areas I would still spank for if I could do it again, if we could reactivate the process. Before I close, I want to mention one last lesson, though, that we wouldn't change. We finally got something right. As they moved into their teens, we got a concept. We learned a lesson, and we applied it. And this is an area still very fresh in my mind because it involves the teenage phase of raising kids, and that isn't very far back in our lives right now. If we could roll back the years, we would still set clear standards in the home. Strict, but logical, reasonable standards. And we would expect that our teenagers accept them and adhere to them, and they did. You know, every specialist who deals with teenage delinquency will tell you teens want rules. They may test them and they may squawk about them on occasion, and they do that, and that's natural. But deep down, they want them to be there, and if they're not, they will view the lack of rules and the permissiveness as one more form of parental rejection and indifference. You simply can't forget that adolescence is a tumultuous time. It's characterized by frightening changes in their bodies and their minds. There's confusion about life. There are all these hormones bouncing around. There is this incredibly strong peer pressure. And you see, without established limits enforced by loving, reasonable parents, a teenager can so easily simply come unglued and run amok. And he will in many cases, unless they're there. Now, it's a sad commentary that some parents have swallowed the psychological garbage that you got to turn them loose when they're 13 or 14 and you can't do anything with them from that point on at all. Sorry. You know, some people say if you impose any limits, even in the early teens, or you're strict enough to set some rules and to punish when necessary, generally through deprivation of privilege when they're teens. If you do that, they'll hate you, you'll block their developing independence, you'll wound their psyche, they'll bolt, they'll run. My response is fiddlesticks. Quite the contrary. Limits, if they're logical and reasonable, and they must be, imply concern for their well-being. And if the child is bonded with you, and this is essential, as a little kid, They may test those limits as teens, but they will accept them. There'll be a little grumbling from time to time, but they will accept them. I go to Italy a lot, and Italians in general haven't swallowed the Anglo-Saxon myth that rules and teenagers don't mix. And a lot of families in Italy still have very high standards in the church and out of the church as well. And I've had visitors in Italy who visit in other capitals in Europe, other cities in Europe, other countries, say, teenagers don't look real great in some of the big cities of Europe, but you come to Italy and they look pretty good. They look sort of clean cut. And, you don't see a lot of punkers in the streets in Italy or a lot of spiky hair or things like that. And they say to me, how come? Why is Italy the sort of exception? And I look at people and I say, it's quite simple. There's a lady at home in all Italian families called Mamma. And she won't allow it. And a 15-year-old gets his hair spiked and comes home and it's dyed purple, and Mama sticks his head in the sink, gets the dye out, cuts it off, and that's the end of that. Simple. The answer to that problem is Mamma. And a gentleman in all Italian families who is sometimes called Papa or Babbo. Wonderful people. I have seen, I must say this, more sort of modified punky hairdos. Modified, but nonetheless punky-ish, in congregations of the Worldwide Church of God in the USA and the UK than I've ever seen in the streets of fashionable, sophisticated towns like Milano and Rome. Well, you have to have some rules. I'll tell you a few of the rules we had, and that we would have again. They're my rules. That's all I can say for them. We had strict rules on dating. I won't tell you what they were because I think every family ought to set their own basic rules, but they were strict. Pretty strict dating rules. We didn't allow wild rock music, and they learned to monitor that on the Sabbath. We expected the Sabbath to be respected, and it was. Blows my mind when I hear about parents in the church with 13 and 14-year-old kids, and you say, how's young John doing, or Jeannie? They're 14. And the parent says, they don't come to church anymore. And I say, they don't? And I'm thinking, about 14-year-old is a kid. And we told our kids, they live under our roof, they live in our home, in their teens, they respect the Sabbath, they're a part of the church, and that was simply the way it was. I certainly am aware of the fact that, kids get to be 18, 19, 20. There is a time when you cannot require that of them by any means. But 13 or 14, I hear about that and I think, Italians, that would blow the mind of Italians. And if brethren in Italy knew that there were 13 or 14-year-old kids, members of the church families in the USA who don't come to services, that would offend most of our families in Italy, in fact, because they view 14-year-olds as children. That's because they are. They're growing up, but they're still kids. We reserve the right to be involved in the selection of friends. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 53 tells us that bad companions can wreck you. And I've seen kids in the Church of God devastated by negative peer pressure. Now that's touchy and that's sensitive and it requires a lot of talking, but we would do it again. Without harping on it, we were also involved because we had daughters in things like clothing styles and hair fashions. We wanted them to be up to date, certainly, but not trendy. They didn't watch rock videos and see, what's her name, these crazy names these rock video stars have, Cindy Lauper or Lauper or whatever, and our kids weren't allowed to sort of imitate such nutty hairstyles. They were always up to date though. And of course, very short hairstyles were always taboo during those years because of 1 Corinthians 11 verse 15. Simply wasn't something they could even consider. They weren't always thrilled. We had daughters. Consequently, sometimes clothing had to be returned to the shops or the stores, especially jeans and bathing suits about half the time. You have sons, you don't worry about jeans and bathing suits, but you have daughters, you do. And we sent them back, and sometimes there were tears. But I'll tell you something before I close. I asked my daughters a few years ago what were the best years of their lives. Interesting what they responded. My eldest daughter said the year I was 14. It's a teenage year. That's interesting. I like that answer. I asked the other two, the twins, and they both said the year we turned 16 to 17, the best years of our lives. They didn't say when we were 5 or 8 or 11, because those weren't always the best years. We were making far too many mistakes at that point in our life. The teenage years. Why? Well, YOU was wonderful, and that was a lot of fun for them. 2 of them went to Imperial, and that was a great experience. And there were perks. We gave them independence in certain areas of their lives. We let them do things on their own, because young adults need that as they grow up. But there were also rules and standards. And brethren, when you establish rules and you hold the line, that allows young people to channel all of this energy, you see, into school and growth and fun and learning, and the wild confusion that occurs when standards aren't there or kept to a bare minimum. So our kids view those years as good years. My wife and I do as well. We finally hit our stride. We'd made so many mistakes, and finally we learned at least a few lessons. We began to get on top of what it means to be a parent. We're still working at it. I'm very grateful that my 3 daughters have been willing to forgive us for mistakes that we made. We made a lot. We've had a harder time forgiving ourselves. That's the hard part, especially my wife. She has a rough time forgiving herself. And I do too. But it's coming. Now, God gives His children for many reasons. To teach us how to love, but also to teach us how to repent, teach us how to say, I'm sorry, to teach us how limited we are, and how much we need His guidance in our lives. One last thing I'd like to say to you before this weather-beaten old guy goes back to his rocking chair. If you've made some mistakes with your kids and there are scars, don't give up, brethren. I don't care how old your kids are. In their teens, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, you've made some mistakes. Don't ever give up. If you have to say, I'm sorry, write them a letter and say, I'm sorry. That may open their hearts back up again. That may turn it back. You can wash away some of the old resentments, some of the old hurts. You know, the prodigal can come home. He's more apt to come home if he's sure he'll receive forgiveness when he comes. Alienation can be conquered. There are all these church kids out there, and they're not coming to church. There are a lot of them. And they're in their teens, some of them are in their 20s, some in their 30s. My wife is a church kid, and my wife and I are going fast towards 50. And my wife was raised in the church. There are church kids out there in their 40s and early 50s. Would you believe that? Who aren't a part of the church, though. But it's in their minds and their hearts. But there's alienation there. There's coldness. Want to do something about it? Why not write your kids a letter? Tell them how much you love them. Tell them how much they mean to you. Malachi 4 applies at every age. It applies to grandparents. It applies to people my age. It applies to young families. You can begin to soften their hearts. That is so terribly important. Brethren, those little hearts, when they're little kids, need to be filled with love and affection. As they get older, those hearts will harden and they'll become cold. But you can soften them again. You can bring the warmth back. You can bind yourself to them. It'll take work, but it can be done. Now, there's nothing like the family to teach you about God, teach you how to love. You can learn the lessons. You can learn the lessons, and you can fulfill the reason why God has blessed us with children. I'll tell you, it takes some repenting, takes some humility. You learn a lot of lessons, but it's all worth it. I hope you'll be a part of the process of parenting, just as I am. I'm not raising kids anymore, but I'm still a father. I've still got daughters to parent, and I've got sons-in-laws to parent. I've got grandchildren to parent. The process goes on.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.